thank you. Welcome back after lunch, everyone. Thank you for coming to this session, which is entitled Our Struggles Are United, Palestine and Climate Justice. My name is Peter Leary. I'm Deputy Director of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. The climate justice movement continues to mobilise in solidarity with Palestinians, recognising that the struggles against genocide, apartheid and colonialism, and for indigenous rights, land rights and climate justice are profoundly intertwined. The climate crisis is both caused and exacerbated by global inequality and oppression. Palestinians living under Israel's system of colonialism, military occupation and apartheid with no control over their land or natural resources are highly vulnerable to the climate crisis. Israel steals and appropriates Palestine's natural resources, including land and water, while rising temperatures are exacerbating desertification as well as water and land scarcity, entrenching climate apartheid. Israel's genocidal assault on Palestinians in the Gaza Strip will cause long-term environmental impacts. Its relentless bombardment of Gaza has produced more planet-warming gases than 20 climate-vulnerable nations do in a year. Forensic architecture describe Israel's devastation of Gaza's agricultural land and infrastructure, as well as its water treatment capacity, as, quote, a widespread and deliberate act of ecocide that has exacerbated the ongoing catastrophic famine in Gaza and is part of a wider pattern of deliberately depriving Palestinians of critical resources for survival. At the same time, here in Britain, those institutions that prop up Israel's system of oppression are often deeply implicated in the fossil fuels industry. This panel will explore how our movements are connected and how we take forward our joint struggle for justice. I want to first introduce the three speakers, then I will hand over to them to speak in turn, then I'll open it up for questions and contributions from the floor, and we'll have a roving mic going around the room. So our speakers today, we have Robin Wells is a climate and protest rights campaigner. Having been a member of the grassroots climate movement for many years, she became the director of Fossil Free London in 2021. A graduate in politics and philosophy, she's especially interested in the use of social media for campaign goals, bringing new people into the movement and defending the right to protest. Lotika Singha is an activist based in the Midlands and a co-founding member of International Solidarity for Academic Freedom in India. INSAF India understands academic freedom as a collective freedom that is inextricably linked to radical social, economic and ecological justice, and advocates for building global solidarities with anti-caste, anti-colonial and anti-imperial Indian and international peoples movements, in particular indigenous peoples movements. Lotika also represents INSAF India in Fossil Free Science Museum, a coalition that at present comprises 14 organisations and has been campaigning to keep fossil fuel money and influence out of the museum. It is in this connection that Lotika will be speaking today. So I'm very pleased to hand over to the first of our speakers.
So thanks so much for having me. I'm going to speak specifically today about the UK struggle against the climate crisis and why solidarity with Palestine is important for that. I'm really delighted to be here and excited to hear about the expertise and comments of the audience on the situation within Palestine, ecocide there. That isn't my speciality. I'll be speaking about London and our protest movement and why Palestine's important. So at Fossil Free London, we fight for climate justice with an understanding that oppression of race and class is a fundamental component, a fundamental pillar of why we're in this crisis in which the very ecosystems that keep us all alive, fed, watered, and housed are crumbling all around us. Our work, climate work, is peace work because the fossil fuel industry is waging a war on us. Their rapacious desire for fossil fuels, for the money that comes from these resources that need to be left in the ground, is causing hundreds of thousands of casualties worldwide into the millions. And within the near future, will cause millions into the billions of casualties worldwide. We are facing a war on humanity by people who have known for decades that their product will not only cause us a little bit of damage, harm us here and there, but fundamentally undermine our political, economic and social structures and our ability to continue to not only have a good quality of life and a better quality of life than our parents before us, but to actually, in millions of cases, have any life at all. These fossil fuel companies like Shell and BP, we know because of climate files, because of the information that is widely available online, have known for decades what they're doing, and they continue to do it. So we, as part of the work that we do here in London, we fight against these companies. We go to their offices, we go into their annual general meetings, we protest on the street to raise attention to the fact that these companies are the problem and that people power and collective action is the solution. We're used to thinking about colonialism because obviously here in London there's a huge legacy of it. You only need to go to Parliament Square to see those statues which so indicate the colonial past of this city, Gandhi to Churchill. And huge financial flows come through London, and many major fossil fuel companies are headquartered here, like Shell. After they were chased out of the Netherlands by great activists there, Shell must fall, and they lost a court case which has demanded that they cut their emissions under law. Our core mission is to get fossil fuels out of our city. But climate action without climate justice will just produce today's problems again. Because climate change leaves a whole body of people as sacrificial to the profit of fossil fuel industries and to the personal connections and career aspirations of our politicians. So peace work is climate work, and it's connected to Palestine for two reasons. The first is that war and militarism have a huge climate impact. You know, the companies that produce weapons, the companies that produce fossil fuels and benefit from war, that has a massive impact on our ecosystems, our biodiversity, and our ability to ultimately survive. As we heard, Israel's bombardment of Gaza caused more emissions in the first 2 months than the 20 most climate vulnerable countries combined. And when we say climate vulnerable countries, what we mean is countries that will disappear from the face of the earth as we know them because of these knowing emissions being put into the atmosphere by the fossil fuel industry. So countries like the Solomon Islands, which will disappear beneath the waves, where people there are starting to think about digital culture and digital preservation of their identities, because actually the physical manifestation of their country is soon to be lost. So war produces loads of emissions and creates massive industry profits. It's a tale as old as time that the oil industry benefits from war. And in this case, they also benefit from new oil and gas licenses. So BP was awarded a license to explore off the coast of Gaza since October 7th. And at Fossil Free London, we've been doing protests outside BP and other companies. The second reason that the climate crisis, that climate justice needs to include Palestine, is because actually the corporations we're fighting that pursue profit at any cost are not only responsible for mass heat waves that, according to Global Witness, will cause 11.5 million deaths by the end of the century, they're also responsible for oppression in Palestine. And for that, let me tell you about two key examples. So, the first is Barclays and its massive fossil fuel funding, and the second is the Rosebank oil field. So let's talk about Barclays. You might have seen in the press, with really impressive campaigning against Barclays that's been incredibly successful, that Barclays is responding saying, hey, like, we don't have shares directly in these companies, like, leave us alone. So let me talk to you about loans and underwriting. So Barclays has contributed $7.6 billion in loans and underwriting. And what is underwriting? It's acting as a fundraiser for companies. So in this case, the companies that prop up the oppression of Palestinians and the apartheid regime that they live under. So these can be companies like Raytheon, or it can be companies like Caterpillar, either ones that are involved in the bombardment of the Palestinian people, creating missiles and weapons and drones, or also those companies that are necessary for the knocking down of Palestinian homes, like Caterpillar. So as underwriters, Barclays basically go with a fundraising bucket to financial institutions and say, hey, we've got this company here, Caterpillar, and they're a really great place to give some of your money to. They get those people, a bunch of people in a room, and in exchange for a pretty fee, they convince them to put money into the bucket in the form of debt. The arms company or company complicit in the apartheid of Palestine can then take that money away, and that is real economic financing, fresh money for those companies to use on tanks, fighter jets, and missiles. A massive total of $48 billion of debt repayments are ending this year, which Barclays has had a key role in. So pressure on Barclays around this funding can be really significant and have a huge impact. And Barclays is really feeling the heat on Palestine. For a long time, campaigners have been talking about Barclays. We've been pushing against those charities and companies that either bank with or are sponsored by the worst bank for fossil fuel financing in Europe. But the wins have been huge since the focus of the Palestine Solidarity campaign has been targeted, since the torch has gone on to Barclays from within this amazing movement. So cultural workers against genocide were speaking here in this room before the lunch break, and likewise were Bands Boycott Barclays, two campaigns that have made huge strides, and we've seen Cambridge question whether they're going to be banking with Barclays anymore, Oxfam the same, Manchester Metropolitan University closed their account, and massive losses in terms of their social license, as loads of festivals are frequented by a whole generation of young people have said, actually, we don't want your sponsorship. These are for a combination of climate and Palestine reasons, and we think that those two causes need to get closer and closer, so we continue to push back against this one enemy together. Now in Fossil Free London, we're pushing back at the National Trust. So the National Trust, I'm sure you've all probably heard of it, has heritage sites and natural sites across the UK, and their core mission is to protect nature, which includes the climate. So it's fundamentally hypocritical and does not fit that the National Trust has as its bank the worst in Europe for funding fossil fuels, when we know that that is what is causing the destruction of nature and ecocide. And if you want to get involved in that campaign, then we're doing a specific meeting about it on the 19th of August. And please follow us on Instagram, Fossil Free London, for more information. Secondly, Ithaca. Ithaca is one of the most horrible companies you've ever not heard of. So Ithaca is what's called a pure play company, which means they only produce oil and gas. They're the 9th largest operator of oil and gas in the North Sea, and they're very significant to the current climate fight, because you've probably heard a lot about oil and gas licenses, but the real fight is oil and gas projects. And there's 2 which are very dangerously close to happening. One's called Rosebank and one's called Cambo, and Ithaca is part of both. Ithaca owns 20% of the Rosebank oil field and 100% of the Cambo oil field, which was effectively stopped a couple of years ago around the time of the COP up in Glasgow. The reason that Ithaca is connected to Palestine is that Ithaca, although based in Scotland, is owned by the Delek Group, one of Israel's largest oil and gas companies, and a company that's on a UN blacklist for human rights abuses, including for having settlements in occupied Palestine. And a recent update of that list kept them on it, so pretty current information as well. Rosebank is a carbon bomb and will lead to massive climate breakdown and absolutely must be stopped. And Ithaca is a key part, a key target, which if we can stop Rosebank. Historically, the Cambo fight was won because the smaller partner that owned that field was forced to pull out, leaving the majority stakeholder unable to go forward. So we can reproduce this with Rosebank with enough pressure on Equinor, the other partner in this Rosebank field. Equinor is a large Norwegian oil and gas company, which is very susceptible to public pressure. So at Fossil Free London, we're campaigning against these companies to stop the Rosebank oil field. And if we stop it, then we also stop millions of dollars going to this Israeli company. So one struggle, one fight, this very much is. Climate action defends people, it defends living beings. Corporations are waging war on us and the earth. And the climate and solidarity actions to stop them are the work of peacemakers. From Palestine to the climate, we are united in our pursuit of peace, justice, and survival, especially for those populations that would be left behind and forgotten unless we come together, act in solidarity, and demand our lives. Thank you.
It's a great honor to be part of this panel today. I'm Lotika, and to be here with Dina and Robin, and to be talking about the Fossil Free Science Museum campaigns, of which I'm also privileged to be part of. Currently, we are demanding that the Science Museum cut its ties with the fossil fuel giant, the Adani Group, which is sponsoring an exhibition in the museum. I'll start by talking about the Adani Group and its influence. Then I'll shift to the Science Museum and a campaign's work on the Adani sponsorship. I'll explore why the Science Museum might be so determined to maintain this sponsorship, bringing in Adani Group's connections between India and the UK, as well as between India and Israel. Finally, I'll attempt to tie all these aspects together to show how this issue of corporate sponsorship is intricately linked to climate injustice and the broader genocidal geopolitics of settler colonialism. So the Adani Group is based in India, and its founder, Gautam Adani, started out as a modest commodity trader in 1988. But between 2014 and 2022, he very quickly became India's biggest oligarch. His rise mirrored the rise of his close friend, India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. The Adani Group is the biggest private producer of coal and the 3rd largest developer of new coal mines in the world. Adani also deals in seaports, airports, railways, palm oil, gas, real estate, green energy, and the weapons industry. It partners with Elbit Systems to produce Hermes drones in an India-based factory, and these drones are being used in the genocide in occupied Palestine. Adani partners with IWI, which is Israel Weapon Industries, to produce assault rifles and other weaponry. The group also has a 70% stake in the Haifa port. Now, Hermes drones are also being used in India in the repression of indigenous Adivasi peoples. India's indigenous peoples number about 104 million at the last census, which is around 8 to 10% of its population. The Adivasis are the tribes who have for centuries lived mostly in the forests of central and eastern India. Protecting the biodiversity of these forests is crucial for climate justice, and the Adivasis understand this better than anyone else. The drones are being used to both surveil as well as drop bombs as a way to clear the lands of its Adivasi residents. Israeli assault rifles are also used by India's militarized police forces, who are implicated in the extrajudicial killings of Adivasis. Over 150 people have been killed since January in one area called Bastar. More generally, to make way for Adani's coal mines, coal-fired power stations, ports, and green technology, as well as for other similar corporates and state projects, Adivasi and other rural communities are being harassed, injured, displaced, dispossessed, and killed. Systematic sexual violence is also a part of this, as is everyday violence. For example, in Bastar's mining areas, there are militarized police camps at every 2 to 5 kilometers that also serve as checkpoints like in Palestine, and drones have filmed Adivasi women bathing in the rivers. Like in Palestine, the exploitation and repression are not going unchallenged, have never been. Historically, Adivasis were among the first communities to stand up against British colonialism in the Indian subcontinent. Today, there are many, many Adivasi movements standing up against India's internal colonialism, like the now decade-long movement against the deforestation of the ancient eco-sensitive Hasdeo forest to facilitate Adani's coal expansion. And here, the protest site is very frequently burned down by the police on behalf of these corporates and the state. Another movement is ongoing in Godda, where Adani runs a coal-fired power plant. When I was in India recently, I talked about the Science Museum in Adani to a group of Adivasi people. They explained that all these projects are against the country's constitutional mandate to the Adivasis to preserve their lands, forests, culture, and customary self-governance. They said, we've been fighting against Adani and the others like him for years, despite the efforts of such corporates to use the entire Indian state machinery to put us down. These efforts include ignoring legislations, threatening to kill us, slapping fabricated criminal cases on us, jailing us, humiliating us, and trying to break our unity. They hold fake people's assemblies and then lie that we have consented to the destruction of our land and environment. In this way, they are forcibly grabbing our fertile agricultural lands and our bountiful forests. At Godda, besides severe pollution, the groundwater level has fallen by 400 feet due to the thermal plant, and government officials stationed in the area have moved their offices elsewhere. But the Adivasis have nowhere to go. They can either stay and suffer the health consequences and livelihood loss, or become footloose laborers and and domestic servants to be exploited elsewhere. The Adani Group is also involved in cultural genocide. For example, it collaborates with the Kalinga Institute for Social Sciences, a residential or factory school where Adivasi children are taught that their families' ways are primitive and uncivilized to make the children self-hate who they are and where they come from, to destroy the connection with the land and people. Preeti Adani, wife of Gautam Adani, has been quoted saying, "Education is the most powerful tool for social transformation, in line with Zionism's claim to bring civilization to Palestine." The Adani Group is implicated also in the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar, and in Australia, Adani's Carmichael mine is built on the sacred sites of the Wangan Jagalingu traditional owners who are standing up against this travesty. Coal from Carmichael also goes to Godda. The trail of human rights violations and climate injustice this arrangement has created is as long as the distance between them. Briefly, Carmichael coal travels on an Adani-owned rail line for 200 miles to the North Queensland export terminal owned by Adani Ports. Then it's shipped through coral-rich waters for about 6,000 miles to Dhamra Port, located in a very eco-sensitive area of India. From Dhamra, which is also owned by Adani Ports, the coal travels nearly 500 miles to Godda, and the electricity then produced at Godda travels another few hundred miles to Bangladesh, for it is not being produced for India or the Adivasis in Godda itself. So now I'm going to move on to the Science Museum. Now, the Science Museum is part of the UK's Public Science Museum Group, whose mission is to inspire the next generations of scientists, inventors, and engineers. It remains accountable to the state through the Department of Culture, Media, and Sport. The Science Museum started taking sponsorship from fossil fuel companies like BP, Shell, and Equinor some years ago for exhibitions on climate solutions aimed at children and public education. In 2021, groups such as Culture Unstained, XR Scientists, and UK Youth for Climate Justice, who have been campaigning against this, came together as the Fossil Free Science Museum campaign. Now comprising 14 organizations, it also includes Fossil Free London and other anti-mining and climate action groups, as well as 3 Indian diasporic collectives. Presently, the campaign is focusing on the Adani sponsorship, and for our action in March this year, we were also joined by Parents for Palestine, who have also been doing other actions and run a website called the Genocide Museum. They have a petition against the sponsorship, and which will be sent to the museum's board's trustees, and I would say please do visit the website and sign it if you haven't already. Our campaign too has done a range of actions in and outside the museum, but today's focus is on what the campaign has unearthed about the sponsorship through freedom of information requests. However, I will mention here that in July, Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall withdrew from hosting a book event in July at the Science Museum, and the Science Museum has also ended its the Equinor sponsorship through the work of the campaign. So that's been 2 wins recently. Now, coming back to Adani, it was in October 2021, during the UK government's Global Investment Summit, which was being held in the Science Museum, that the museum announced the Adani Green, which is a subsidiary of the Adani Group, would sponsor an Energy Revolution gallery very soon. However, early talks on the sponsorship, which started around November 2020, were between the museum and the Adani Group. As per procedures, a due diligence report was commissioned by the museum in December. Within 2 weeks, it highlighted a catalogue of criminal investigations, corruption litigation, environmental issues, cronyism, and human rights abuses. In addition, the Adani Group failed the museum's sustainability criteria for sponsors. But rather than all this ringing alarm bells, the museum's director, who is also the director and executive of the Science Museum Group as a whole, Ian Blatchford, immediately began pushing the negotiations with the Adani Group forward. The due diligence report was never shared with the museum's trustees. Instead, in January 2021, another report was prepared in the space of a day, this time only for Adani Green. It was shared with the trustees as a formality. But Adani Green Energy shares have been used as collateral to finance the Carmichael coal mine via Adani Enterprises. Because of this, Adani Green has been removed from the UN-backed Science-Based Targets Initiative. So the great idea to shift the sponsorship from Adani Group to Adani Green is really part of Adani Green washing. Yet the museum stands by its decision. Now, the sponsorship model here, on the face of it, it is a multinational sponsoring a specific exhibition, and it's not uncommon among the elite public institutions like the Science Museum or British Museum to do this. In return for this philanthropy, these museums provide the companies opportunities to promote their brands in spaces meant for public education and enjoyment of the arts and sciences, and inflating national pride, which then enhances the social acceptance of these companies. But it isn't just that simple. During the summit announcing the sponsorship, former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson had a meeting with Gautam Adani. He also visited the Adani headquarters in July 22 when he visited India, and where he and Narendra Modi gave a go-ahead for drafting the UK-India Free Trade Agreement, which was a first for UK to do with, which will be, if it happens, it still hasn't happened fully though, with the Global South country. Now, Culture Unstained put in a Freedom of Information request to the UK Cabinet for details about the meetings, but the request was turned down. According to the Cabinet Office, it could harm the UK's international relations by, amongst other things, reducing investor trust in the UK if the meetings information was released that quickly after the meetings. Press notes, however, tell us that Adani told Johnson he was pledging $70 million towards energy transition, and they also discussed aerospace and defense collaboration, meaning weapons. The director of UK Defense and Security Exports has also had a meeting with the Adani Group representatives. So does the sponsorship contribute to corporate investments in the UK then? Because that's what the kind of worry seemed to be about. But the sums don't add up. In 2013, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport contributed 62% of the Science Museum Group's funding, and in 2022-23, 10 years later, it is around 63%, meaning that the group is still largely funded by the taxpayer. Sponsorship and corporate membership in 22-23 accounted for a mere 1.47% of the Science Museum's group's total income. Clearly, the opportunity for the sponsoring companies to showcase themselves vastly outweighs the benefit to the taxpayer. For example, when the Adani exhibition opened, we were quite bemused to see full-page advertisements announcing this with greenish colors on the front page of English language mainstream news dailies thousands of miles away in India. Perhaps Gautam Adani was telling fellow Indians that he, and with him India, has arrived on the world stage in London. Such triumphs of the Adani Group show us what Indian colonialism within India is about, and also its links with colonialism elsewhere, like in Palestine. Adivasi communities, the existential danger that the state, corporate and militarized mining nexus has posed for the Adivasi communities is presently at a critical point once again. The region, called Bastar, is saturated with militarization. There is like one militarized police to every 9 people, ostensibly to eradicate the armed resistance movement that has been going on there for over 40 years, and ostensibly to provide security for the people, but in reality to aid the land grab in the region. This hypocritical stance of the Indian state towards its own people is also reflected in its stance towards regarding Palestine. Even though India was one of the first countries to recognize Palestine as a state, in the background it already had a relationship with Israel, one that has been normalizing since the 1990s through extensive military, economic and strategic partnerships, including the use of Israeli spyware like Pegasus on Indian citizens. The Adani Group's dealings with Elbit and IWI are only 2 of many partnerships between Indian and Israeli companies covering a range of areas from IT to weapons to electro-optics. Azad Esser's recent book, Hostile Homelands, also exposes a lot about the Indian-Israel connection through the lens of their settler colonial projects in Palestine and Kashmir. I'll conclude now. So the sponsorship model being followed by the Science Museum is really a kind of corporate philanthropy, state brokerage complex through which crony fossil fuel companies like Adani Group, the Adani Group, and the political elite of both the global north and the global south build consent in the publics of the metropole for the broader mutual interest in settler colonial genocidal projects elsewhere. Projects that are simultaneously taken forward through coercion tactics among the resisting publics in the peripheries by the very same actors. The Adivasis and the Indian civil society standing with them understood all this very early, in which they also understood and recognized that unless Palestine will be free, none of us will be free. And it is in this spirit that in February, workers at a port in India from where the weapons for Israel were being shipped, they stood in strike and refused to load the ships. Thank you.